Again, Happy New Year. Good to see everyone here. We are jumping back into Romans this year as we start 2022. Glad to be back with everyone. Glad everyone is here back with us. We are today going back into Romans 12, going to look at a few verses there, talking about how to deal with your enemies. So how do we deal with the enemies in our lives? What do you do? What do we do when we're hurt by someone, when someone turns into our enemy? How do we deal with them? How do we respond to them? What happens? How does that unfold? So the question I want to pose to you this morning is, do you have any enemies right now? Have you had in the past any enemies? Maybe they were close to you and now they're not, or maybe you're on the brink of them not being close to you right now. Maybe they're sitting right next to you. I don't know. But maybe you have had enemies in the past. I've had enemies in the past. In fact, I was 16 years old. And my sister and I, we were really close when we lived with our parents. We liked to hang out together. And one night, I don't know, I was bored. And I said, hey, I have an idea. Let's prank call someone. And she was like, oh, okay, that's cool. Now, you have to understand with me, when I make a prank, now I don't do this anymore, okay? So you can rest assured I'm not going to call you and prank call you. But when I made prank calls in the past, it was not like, hey, is your refrigerator running? You better go catch it. No, that's not what it was. And it wasn't like dark and spooky and scary. It was like I would talk in a certain voice, and I would get to the point where I would make sure you knew that it wasn't like someone like dangerous, but you still didn't know who it was, but you were interested enough to carry on a conversation. And so what I did was like, hey, let's call. And she's like, let's call my friend, Kristen. Cool, let's call Kristen. And that was one of her good friends at the time, and so we called Kristen. Maybe the first couple of times she didn't know who it was, so she just hung up. But then I called back, because of course I'm going to call back. And so I called back, and all of a sudden she's like, oh, all right, so I'll just carry on a conversation with you. Now, I'm not sure how long this went on for, how many times I did this, but we would, on the speakerphone, Katie my sister would tell me things to say, I would think of things to say, and we'd carry on a conversation, and come to the point where she's like, oh, okay, that's cool. And eventually, she knew who we were, and it was like, oh, funny, ha, 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 and that was it. Or so I thought, until one Sunday morning at church, this man who was actually working in the same ministry as I was comes up to me and says, hey, my daughter is friends with the girl you were prank calling. I was like, oh, okay. And he's like, my daughter has been getting very dark prank phone calls from someone. And I'm going to just give you some time now to just confess to what you've done. I was like, well, I didn't do it. I'm sorry. That's coincidence, like big coincidence. I was like, I learned my lesson, prank calls, not good. And so I was like, but I didn't do it. I promise, I'm sorry. Good luck with everything. And find the person who did it. And he was a police officer. So he was kind of like, I'm going to look into this. And I'm like, sure. Hey, do your worst, man. Hey, it wasn't me. I have nothing to hide. And so it was all fine for a little bit. And so he comes up to me again. I think he approaches me again, and his attitude kind of changes from kind of like investigating to more interrogating. And it's like, hey, I'm going to really be investigating this. I'm going to look into this because I really think you're the one. I'm like, okay. And now my attitude is changing. Now, we weren't really close to begin with, but now I'm kind of like, man, I really, my vibe towards you right now is kind of like, get away from me. Like, I don't really want to be around you right now. And you're kind of turning from this man who's like an acquaintance, you're cool, down to earth, now someone I don't, because I've told you the truth, and I don't want you like in my face about this again. And so he walks away, and I think a certain time goes on, and nothing happens until one night in youth group. I'm like, again, 16, 17 years old, maybe. I'm in my small group with the other guys, the high school guys, small group leaders there. I get pulled out of my small group from someone. And this person says, the man about the prank calls. He's in one of the pastor's offices, just to let you know, and he's wanting to basically bring you to jail. He's wanting to turn you in. I'm like, are you serious? So I walk into this one of the pastor's offices, and I'm sitting there. One of the pastors is here. An elder of the church is here. Here's this man sitting right in front of me. And again, he's like, now he's turned into, I just don't think you did it. I know you did it. And I'm just going to assume, like we're all in this room going to assume that you are the one who is making these very crude, horrible, dark prank phone calls to my daughter. And he said, Kyle, I want you to let you know, I have a K-9 unit out ready to go to your house and search your house. And I'm thinking, well, I don't know what you're going to search. The dogs are going to search my online phone records? Like, what are they going to search? What are you trying to do? I said, you're either, I didn't say this, but I was thinking, you are either the most worst person for your job, that you can only interrogate one person, or you're just, like this father who's really scared, but you don't know what to do. Or maybe, dude, maybe you just really have it out for me and my family. I didn't know what it was. And it might have been the latter. But at that time, when he pulled the K-9 card on me, I was sitting in the chair, and I can just feel my fists just clench up underneath the chair. And what my mind was thinking, what I was wanting to do, if he was going to bring me to jail that night, it wasn't going to be because of the accused false phone calls. Are you picking up what I'm laying down? Okay? That's not why I was going to go to jail that night. But I stayed in my seat, and I again said, I didn't do anything. Finally, one of the other pastors stepped in and just took care of the guy. And we didn't hear from him about it again. But how I dealt with him, and I was again 16, just in this like fleshly, how could you do this to me? I didn't do anything. I am going to, just the thoughts that I was thinking, like I think I should do this. I think, let's do this. And it just became this huge thing. It took me many, many years for me to come to a place where I just kind of like had to forgive him, because it was so detrimental to me, to our family. And I was just like, I can't be around you. And again, we served in the same ministry. Like, how was that? That was, And so I came to a place finally years ago, and I was just like, I gave it to God. But so how do you deal with people in your life who've become your enemy? What do you do? Now, maybe you're here this morning and you're saying, God, man, everyone loves me. I love everyone. We're all good. Like, my life's cool. And if that's true, that's awesome. But for the rest of you, maybe there is someone in your life in the past or the present, and they've hurt you. You've been hurt. You've been offended. Someone you love has been offended, and you have just come to this place where you need to move yourself away from them because you can't take them anymore. Maybe they hurt you so deeply that you responded in such a way that you would want to equally match how they hurt you. Maybe you've been hurt and you decided to close the relationship with silence, distance, or expulsion. You're like, I'm done. Maybe you're currently right now in some kind of attack mode because someone currently is your enemy, and you're sitting here thinking like, how could I best get back at this person? Because this person has turned into my enemy and they are done. Or maybe someone has hurt you, and you're just kind of sitting in your head, kind of like in a comatose state kind of mindset. You're like, I'm hurt, and I really, to be honest with you, don't know how to respond right now, because the person who hurt me never thought that would come from them. I never thought that this person over here would do what they did to me. So I really, right now, I'm just kind of numb. I'm kind of like a still statue. I don't know what's right, what's up and down. I don't know what to do. And if you are on any of those avenues that we just ventured onto, and if I were to hear your story, I would get it. I would completely understand why you responded the way you did. I would completely get why you are at a crossroads right now. Because the truth of the matter is, our flesh desires to respond in such a way that would just equally level and then level up the way we were hurt. That's the truth. Because we want something to make us feel better. We want war. We want payback. We want revenge. And so how do we deal with these enemies? But if I can just persuade you just for a moment to kind of step back from the perspective you currently have about this, and one again that I don't blame you for having. If I heard your story, I wouldn't blame you. But take a step back to a different perspective, one that could maybe alter your life so positively, you might be able to get a little more sleep at night. You might have a little more peace in your life, and maybe even have a little hope that comes from all of the anger, the depression, the anxiety, and the buildup that you are living in right now. Now, dealing with our enemies is not a new problem at all. In fact, it goes all the way back to the Old Testament after the fall of mankind. 1 Samuel 24 gives the account of when David comes into contact with King Saul. And he's put in a predicament about how to respond to an issue he's facing. But let's first back up all the way to 1 Samuel 15, because I want you to get the story and the background of what's going on with David and King Saul. So back up in 1 Samuel chapter 15. Here's what's going on. Samuel comes to King Saul. He's the king of the Israelites. And Samuel says, God is charging you to charge the Amalekites and completely destroy everyone there. Every creature that has breath is going to be destroyed. So that includes women, men, children, babies, animals, everything. And then everything that doesn't have breath, you need to destroy, like completely wipe out, annihilate the Amalekites. King Saul says, hey, that's cool. I'm a king. I got this. Well, something happened before he got to the Amalekite army, or maybe even as he was approaching the Amalekite army, because plans changed. He called an audible and said, all right, troops, this is what we're going to do. We're going to go in, we're going to get the plunder that's beneficiary for us, and we're going to get whatever we can consume or whatever we can take back, because why destroy it? I mean, it's all fine. We'll kill some people. And, King Agag of the Amalekites, don't kill him. Well, let's take him back alive. Let's do that. So after that happened, Samuel comes to King Saul and says, dude, what happened? I told you what to do and you didn't do it. And so Samuel then has to tell Saul, listen, you disobeying God, you're rejecting God as your king. And so God now is rejecting you as the king of Israel. And cue the downward spiral for the rest of Saul's existence. Chapter 16 and 17 comes David's surprising anointing. Samuel travels, doesn't even know who he's going to anoint as the next king. Saul has no idea, only God knows. And so Samuel anoints Saul, and then Samuel anoints David, and then David eventually beats Goliath, and his call is confirmed as the next king of Israel. God then continues to unfold his story and sends evil spirits to torment Saul. And one of Saul's buddies is like, hey man, I know you're dealing with these evil spirits. We got this guy, he's really good on the harp, really good on the lyre. Let him come in and play some music for you while you're being tormented by these evil spirits, and maybe you can calm down and everything will be okay. He's like, okay, cool, bring him in. It's David. Hey, David, how you do? And they become really, really close. And actually, the scripture says that Saul loved him very much. So there was a mutual respect, there was a mutual bond, there was a relationship that was formed between Saul and the evil spirits, with him and David playing music for him to get rid of the evil spirits. And that happened in chapter 16. And then David becomes not only Saul's armor bearer, but eventually he becomes one of his commanding officers. Chapters 18 through 23, though, events change because David's success as an officer, as a warrior, starts to overshadow Saul's. And the women are yelling in the street, hey, Saul, you've killed thousands of people, but David, hey, he's our guy. He's killed tens of thousands of people. And what happens is Saul begins to build some jealousy. He begins to develop this anger, even this hatred towards David. And the next few times Saul has evil spirits come upon him, he tries to kill David. He tries to get other people to kill David. And David's sitting back here going, whoa, I'm just doing what you're telling me to do. And my life is at stake here. And Saul tries to kill him a number of times. And David eventually has to flee for his life. Let's pause there for a moment and think, if you were David, how would you feel if you were in his place? I mean, after slipping through the grip of multiple times from a king, someone who you trusted, who trusted you, someone you loved, and someone who loved you is now wanting you dead. We don't know everything that David was thinking or feeling as he dodged yet another spear from Saul's murderous hand. But maybe, as he left his wife behind, rolled out his blanket among the animals at night, and because he fled, maybe he was afraid that if he closed his eyes for a minute, he might not open them again. Maybe he wondered why God was allowing Saul to consistently pursue him. Maybe he started to feel like he needed to stand up for himself and give Saul a taste of his own medicine. Maybe in these cold, lonely nights, he started to harbor some bitterness towards Saul, and maybe he started to think of ways to get back at Saul, start a war with Saul, get some revenge on Saul. So David hid and camouflaged himself until chapter 24, and this is where we're going to pick up. So now we have the background. David and his men are again hiding from Saul. Because why? Because Saul's hunting him down like a turkey before Thanksgiving. He wants him dead, and he's not stopping. So look at chapter 24, and we're just going to read the first 4 verses now. Look at what the scripture says. It just seems that God has swung open these double doors of justice for David. Listen to what happens. When Saul returned from pursuing the Philistines, he was told, David is in the wilderness near En-Gedi. So Saul took 3,000 of Israel's fit young men. Now, I don't know how many men David had with him, but Saul took 3,000 dudes with him to kill one person. So I'm not sure if that's saying something against how awesome David was or against how inferior Saul felt. But let's continue. So he took 3,000 of Israel's fit young men and went to look for David and his men in front of the rocks of the wild goats. When Saul came to the sheep pens along the road, a cave was there, and he went in to relieve himself. David and his men were staying in the recesses of the cave. This is going to be awesome. So they said to him, look, this is the day the Lord told you about. I will hand your enemy over to you so you can do to him whatever you desire. Sweet. This is what we're looking for, right? Revenge. And so this is what David's response. This is going to be awesome. Then David got up and secretly cut off the corner of Saul's robe. What? Okay, this must be the abridged translation, because the unabridged, I think, says something like this. David looked over his options with his armor bearer. He thought to himself, dagger, too short. Sling, been there, done that. Ah, my sword, that will do the trick. So David took his sword and behind Saul's back, plowed it into the back of Saul. And as Saul saw the sword coming out in front of his stomach, he doubled over onto the floor, noticing David standing in yet another underdog victory. And as Saul was breathing his last few slow breaths, David looked intently into his eyes and said, "This is for Israel. This is for my God. I am the king." That's what we want it to say, right? That's the revenge that we think about in this story, right? I mean, that's why they made the Avengers movies. That's why Marvel exists, right? Payback, revenge. This was David's shot. And what did he do? He became Saul's seamstress. That's what he did. But David was so paradox to how Hebrew warriors thought and acted when they were hunted down but had the opportunity to avenge themselves. Something came over David in verse 4. He knew he shouldn't kill his king, and then he was even convicted further because he was convicted when he cut off the corner of his robes, or even for touching the king's clothes. He felt like, dude, I just messed up big time. David had his enemy on a silver platter, and he said no. David's men said, "We'll take him out for you. Like, stay back, we'll do it." And he said, no. Why would he do that? After all that Saul did to him, after all David did for Saul, Saul turns around and wants him dead, and David's sitting here able to get back. And he says, no. So what I want you to do is just, if you have your hard copy of the Bible, keep your place in 1 Samuel 24. We're going to jump now to Romans. You're like, I thought we were in Romans. We are in Romans. So go to Romans 12. And what Paul is going to give us this morning is going to give us a solution to the problems we face when dealing with our enemies. And there's 4 characteristics I want to just encourage you to try to live by, try to implement in your life as just to help you unload this heavy weight that is pushing you down. And for some of you, this weight has been pulling you down far too long. And it's time to kind of pick yourself out under that weight. So let's read real quick. Romans chapter 12. Verses 17 through 21. This is what Paul is saying. He says, "Do not repay anyone evil for evil. Give careful thought to do what is honorable in everyone's eyes. If possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. Friends, do not avenge yourselves. Instead, leave room for God's wrath. Because it is written, 'Vengeance belongs to me. I will repay,' says the Lord. But if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. For in so doing, you will be heaping fiery coals on his head. Do not be conquered by evil, but conquer evil with good." All right, so the first characteristic, how do we deal with our enemies? First, we're going to deal honorably with them. Look again in verse 17. "Do not repay anyone evil for evil, but give careful thought to do what is honorable in everyone's eyes." I'm not sure about you when you were a kid or your kids now, but my kids don't even know this verse exists. They're like, what? Because constantly, depending on the day, if they've not had enough protein and too much sugar, we're constantly just pulling them apart like they're 2 male hamsters in a ring. And we have to just keep going back guys, you don't need to pay back evil for evil. Don't do that. That's not cool. That's not how we respond. The word repay here, this is what it means. It means to give back or return. So literally means to give back what was given to you. So you give something back to me, I'm going to give it back to you. It sounds fair. It sounds awesome. So it's giving back the lies that were given to me. It's giving back the threats that were given to you. It's giving back whatever you got, and you're just like, I'm just dishing it back. People living in Rome during that time, as Paul's writing, even before that, across the region, people lived by the Pharisaical law, and so it was like, hey man, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. But what Paul's command here is completely it's like unorthodox. It's like never thought, and what he did is he got that from Jesus, because in Matthew 5, as you see on the screen, 30 and 39, Jesus says, you've heard it that was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I tell you, don't resist an evildoer. On the contrary, if anyone slaps you on your right cheek, turn the other to him also. This is an extreme opposite of what people considered as principles to live by back in that day. Completely opposite. And Paul says to deal so in such a way as to show honor. Whoever sees us, Christian or non-Christian, they will know that we have responded and dealt honorably towards the person who. So what does that look like? What does dealing honorably look like? I'm not a Greek scholar, and I don't claim to be, and I probably will never claim to be a Greek scholar. So I love when things are broken down and explained to me like I'm 5 years old, okay? So that's why you'll hear any one of the pastors up here probably refer to a guy named Kenneth Wiest. He's really smart. He's smarter than I will ever be. And so what he did was, there was a section on this verse, and this is what he says about responding in honor. Listen to this. The Christian is exhorted to take careful forethought that his manner of life, his outward expression, conforms to, is honestly representative of what he is as a child of God. So in essence, look before you leap. Think before you act. And actually back in 14, Paul says, hey, bless those who persecute you. Bless them, do not curse. And that includes openly, behind closed doors, cursing someone out, murdering someone in your heart, gossiping, slandering. All of that, by avoiding that, by responding honorably towards one another. And this goes back to how we started chapter 12 in Romans, by living your life as a living sacrifice, being transformed by the renewing of your mind. Okay, so you have your finger back in 1 Samuel 24. We're going to look at verses 5 through 7 real quick. See how this story unfolds for David. Verse 5, he says, afterward, David's conscience bothered him because he had cut off the corner of Saul's robe. He said to his men, I swear before the Lord, I would never do such a thing to my Lord, the Lord's anointed. I will never lift my hand against him, since he is the Lord's anointed. With these words, David persuaded his men, and he did not let them rise up against Saul. David realized by not paying back evil for evil towards Saul, he was dealing honorably. And that's what we are called to do this morning. Second thing, deal peaceably. Deal peaceably. Look at verse 18 back in Romans 12. This is what Paul's saying. If possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. Now, this is a tough one for many of us. Like, we might be able to control our tongues. We might be able to control our actions. But hey, buddy, you took 20 years from my life. I'm not going to pay you back, but you dealt so horribly to me, I'm not going to even pretend to be at peace with you right now. As far as I'm concerned, our relationship is done, and I'm not going to even pretend that everything is A-okay, because it's not. That's what we want to say. And that's what we think. I mean, Paul is being pretty generous here, I think, in saying, hey, don't pay back evil for evil. And then he just goes further and says, in fact, live at peace with everyone, guys. I love what J.D. Greer says about this whole passage. And really, most of this chapter is about relationships, if you look at it. And so when one person gets offended, when one person gets hurt by another, what do? Well, you leave the relationship. You shun the offender. You block them on Facebook. You do whatever you need to do to feel better about yourself and saying, I'm not living at peace with you. This is crazy. This is nonsense. I'm leaving, and this is done. There are two things, though, there's two qualifiers we have to look at in order to really understand the short verse of 18. The first qualifier is this. Paul says, if possible. Now, you have to know this. A possibility is not a certainty. It's a possibility. A possibility is not even a probability. It's a possibility. Do you guys remember that movie with Will Smith, The Pursuit of Happiness? That was an amazing movie. If you haven't seen it, it's been too long, so I'm going to give it away now. But what happens is Will Smith, his character's name is Christopher, and he's really struggling in life. He's just grinding day by day, trying to get by without having to live with his son in a homeless shelter. And one day, he's trying to sell this medical equipment. One day, they're walking in a neighborhood, and they're walking along, and he said, hey, maybe later, possibly we'll go to the football game. And his son was like, yeah, okay, so we're going to go to the football game? He's like, no, I said possibly. Do you know what possibly means? He said, what? Possibly means we might go, we might not go. Probably means there's a really good chance we're going to go. He said, so what does probably mean? He goes, there's a good chance we're going to go. Okay, he's like, all right, so what does possibly mean? And his son goes, I know what possibly means. It means we're not going to the football game. A possibility is not a certainty. The second qualifier Paul says is, as far as it depends on you. Meaning this, do what you should do to encourage peace in the relationship. But once you've done that, guys, we've got to leave it in God's hands. We can't just keep taking it back. We have to stop trying to change the other person, because what's going to happen is we're going to get burned out spiritually, mentally, physically, emotionally, as far as it depends on you. We tell our kids all the time, when we say not to pay back evil for evil, we say, hey, you are only responsible for your own actions. If your brother wants to get in trouble, that's cool. But you are responsible for your own actions. Now, quick side note, because I'm not sure your personal situation here this morning. If you're married and your spouse has become your enemy, God is not for divorce. If you're just kind of like, I just don't feel in love anymore, they're kind of upsetting me, they're taking too much of the comforter at night, they're stealing too much of the milk and the creamer for the coffee, they're my enemy. God's not for removing that form of the relationship. There are only a couple things in Scripture where God allows divorce, and it's abandonment and, it's abandonment and sexual immorality, And under those two things, there's a lot of different things, a lot of different trails you can go down. But if you are in a relationship like that, if you're in a relationship where there's maybe some criminal activity, there's abuse going on, there's abandonment, please talk to one of us, because that is serious. And that is what Paul is saying, as far as it depends on you. You're doing whatever you can in this relationship right now, but literally, biblically, there is a sin that is being pushed against you. That's part of the as far as it depends on you. Because Paul knew, that's aside from marriage now, Paul knew that not everyone in life is going to be BFFs. That's not going to happen. You're going to have friendships. You're going to have even your siblings. People are not always going to get along in life, and Paul knew that. And that's why he made those two qualifiers, if possible, as far as it depends on you. 1 Samuel 24, now, 8 through 11. After that, David got up, went out of the cave, and called to Saul. he says, "My lord the king." And then when Saul looked behind him, David knelt low with his face to the ground and paid homage. David said to Saul, "Why do you listen to the words of people who say, 'Look, David intends to harm you'? You can see with your own eyes that the Lord handed you over to me today in the cave. Someone advised me to kill you, but I took pity on you and said, I won't lift my hand against my Lord, since he is the Lord's anointed. Look, my father, look at the corner of your robe in my hand, for I cut it off, but I didn't kill you. Recognize that I have committed no crime or rebellion. I haven't sinned against you, or even though you are hunting me down to take my life." David did what was possible for him to do in his relationship with Saul. He dealt peaceably with Saul. Number 3, deal submissively. Paul says in verse 19 in Romans 12, he says, "Friends, do not avenge yourselves. Instead, leave room for God's wrath, because it is written, 'Vengeance belongs to me. I will repay,' says the Lord." Now, for some of you, this might be even more difficult because for so long you've lived your own life on your own terms, in your own way, and in your own time. Letting God guide you and lead you has become a foreign thing to you because over time you've seen that when you tried to let God lead you, he didn't answer you in your timing, and he didn't do what you thought you were going to do. He didn't respond how you wanted him to respond. So you kind of moved yourself back from God. You're like, I'm going to go ahead of God now, and I am going to live my own life on my own terms. And I get that if that's what you did. But something that is fascinating about God is that though his thoughts are never our thoughts, though his ways are much higher than our ways, as Isaiah says, it always seems to be better for us in the long run when we stop walking in front of God and move ourselves back behind him and start following him instead. There are plenty times throughout the scriptures where God makes his description well known when it comes to judgment, revenge, and discipline. I mean, we see it so often, not only in David's predicament with Saul, but all of the other enemies that David had in the Psalms. David says so often, begging God, "Vindicate me, God, come and avenge me." He doesn't say, "I'm going to avenge myself." He asks God, "Avenge me, do it for me." Our job is not to vindicate, but it's to submit to the Lord. And when we've come to a place where we understand the difference between God's roles and our roles, in the end, it's far better for everyone involved. Only God can take vengeance and take a story and turn it around for his glory. Look how David responds to Saul. Verse 12. He says, "May the Lord judge between me and you, and may the Lord take vengeance on you for me, but my hand will never be against you. As the old proverb says, wickedness comes from wicked people. My hand will never be against you. Who has the king of Israel come after? What are you chasing after? A dead dog? A single flea? May the Lord be judge and decide between you and me. May he take notice and plead my case and deliver me from you." David understood this so well, probably from past experience. And he dealt submissively towards God in front of Saul. And that's what Paul is telling us to do in Romans. Deal submissively with your enemies. Don't avenge. That's not going to get you anywhere, but only into deeper, deeper anger and hatred. Last thing. Deal kindly. Look what Paul says in verse 20 and verse 21. "But if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. For in so doing, you will be heaping fiery coals on his head. Do not be conquered by evil, but conquer evil with good." So if our job is not to take revenge, then what is left for us to do? Like, what is life, right? That's how we feel sometimes. Like, what can I do then if I can't take revenge on my enemy? Because I've been dealt a pretty tough hand. Paul says, just deal kindly. And he uses a proverb to give an example for what he means. We'll look at in a second. I mean, how crazy, right? Like after what he said about me, how you treated me, you expect me to be kind to you now and to provide for you if you're in need? You're insane. But two things happen when that happens, when we do that. First, God moves us and conforms our hearts and minds to his. And second, God works out his plan and goal with our enemies. Only God can do that. How humbling is it for both parties when our enemies come to us and say, I need help. I am in a little trouble, and I just need some bailing out right now. That sounds like a personal problem. That's what we want to respond with. However, when we actually help our enemies, it humbles us to a place to be a servant like Jesus. He served us though we rejected him. He loved us though we hated him. And when our enemies deserve it the least, but need it the most, we're there. You're there, helping, being kind, dealing kindly. It also humbles the enemy because they've come to a place where they have to go back to their neighbor and ask for help. Let me explain real quick what Paul meant by heaping fiery coals. And maybe this can kind of give a wrap about what he's talking about. In ancient times, when you would want to heat up food or stay warm, it's not like today where you can preheat your oven. You know, we have a double oven, and the top one is awesome. You can cook, you can preheat it for pizza. Whatever is unhealthy is what I use the oven for. But you can preheat that bad boy to 450 in under 5 minutes. It's ready to go. You can put whatever you want in the oven. And it's really fast. But in ancient times, they didn't have electricity. They didn't have gas like that. They had literally to keep coals burning and hot to be able to do whatever they wanted with heat. And so what would happen is if a man or a woman ran out of hot coals, if their coals got too cold, they'd have to turn to their closest neighbor to look for help. They had to go to the next door and say, hey man, I need to make food for my kids. Do you have any coals on the fire? Do you got anything hot ready to go? And they're like, yeah. And a kind neighbor wouldn't just give like a couple of coals. The friend in need would come with a big pan, and they would carry it on their head, as was the custom. And the kind neighbor would literally heap a pile, if they could, heap a pile of coals onto the man's head with the pan on top. And the man or the woman would then walk back to their house with the fiery coals that were just heaped on their head. Hence, heap burning coals on his head. And who knows, maybe through the act of kindness, maybe the kindness shown to the offender, him feeling the hot stones on his head, maybe then God uses that kindness to convict and change the heart of the offender. But through your act of kindness, through your kindness towards them, God can transform them. He can lead them to a repentant heart, something that none of us can do on our own. And through all of this, maybe even a relationship can be healed in the process. Maybe we can see hope through this, all because of God. Now let's see real quick what David did, how he responded. Verse 16, when David finished saying these things to him, Saul replied, "Is that your voice, David, my son?" Then Saul wept aloud and said to David, "You are more righteous than I, for you have done what is good to me, though I have done what is evil to you. You yourself have told me today what good you did for me. When the Lord handed me over to you, you didn't kill me. When a man finds his enemy, does he let him go unharmed? May the Lord repay you with good for what you've done for me today. Now I know for certain you will be king, and the kingdom of Israel will be established in your hand. Therefore, swear to me by the Lord that you will not cut off my descendants or wipe out my name from my father's family." Look at David's response. David swore to Saul. Then Saul went back home, and David and his men to the stronghold. I don't think David and Saul ever became best friends after that point. but how David responded to Saul changed not only David's outlook and the rest of David's life, but think about how his actions in front of his men maybe even changed their lives. Maybe some of the men that were on Saul's side saw like, oh my gosh, I've never seen this before in my life. Someone could have been killed right here. Actually, David could have killed Saul twice, and he didn't either time. David understood that when he dealt kindly with his king, that it was far better for him in the long run, than anything could ever happen. His treatment towards Saul was not based on circumstances. It was based on truth. This morning, I'm not sure what you're going through. And I'm not sure what kind of circumstances, what hand you've been dealt. Maybe there's an enemy in your life. I don't know. But just imagine for a second. Imagine what would happen if each person here today, and if you're watching this later on online, if we kind of took back a step and kind of just like took off our skepticals and viewed life from a different perspective, from how David viewed life, how Paul told us to view life. Imagine what we could do, not only individually, but together as a church body for our enemies, for each other, for our community, for the greater Tampa area, and ultimately for God's kingdom. Honor could be displayed. Peace could be pursued. Submission could be yielded. Kindness can be demonstrated, and maybe relationships could be restored. So what I'm going to do is just give you a moment of just silence, just to go along with you and God, and allow him to just continue to talk to you and tell you how he wants you to respond. Maybe the relationship was so long ago that you just have to, in your heart now, just say, God, I got to forgive this person. I'm not going to talk to the person. It's been 25 years. Maybe he wants you to talk to the person. I don't know. But maybe there is something going on where you just need to right now ask God, how do you want me to deal with my enemy? Should take a moment.